George?
Hello. John, are you there?
Hey, yes.
Hi.
Once again, the miracle of modern technology.
Yes, how's life?
It's good. It's good. But actually, I'm in a sort of cranky mood this morning, and I wonder if I can rant at you for a moment.
Well, yeah. What's the problem?
Okay. This has to do with a friend of mine who has a son, a friend of my son's, and has been going through this very annoying medical process that has to do with medical imaging, which is one of my, or medical testing more broadly, which is one of my pet peeves.
Nothing serious, I hope, as far as...
No, it's not, and that's sort of the point. So let me just briefly tell you what happened.
Yeah, what's the deal?
So this is a 13-year-old kid who was complaining of tinnitus, a sort of ringing in the ear.
Yeah.
And his parents sent him to the pediatrician who tested him, his hearing, and gave him a bunch of tests, and the kid was perfectly fine. But the doctor said, just to be sure, it's possible that there can be these small tumors on the auditory nerve that can cause tinnitus. So let's get an MRI. So they said, okay. Even though she'd said it was very improbable, she had recommended it.
Like basically a brain scan?
Yes, an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which is becoming very popular these days.
Yeah.
So the kid got the MRI, and it didn't show any tumors, but there was this little fuzzy area in the inner ear that the radiologist at the hospital said looked kind of funny, and he thought it might be caused by the demyelinization of some nerves in the inner ear. Anyway, again, highly improbable, but they recommended the kid go to a neurologist.
Yeah.
So another medical appointment.
Yeah.
And so then, the parents take the kid to this neurologist, and he's looking at the MRI, and he says, it's really probably nothing, but this isn't a very good MRI. So I'd like your son to go to a different hospital and get another
better
MRI.
Oh, man.
Meanwhile, I find out that I was actually driving my son around with a couple of other boys. We were going to a movie, and I brought this up, and they said they all had ringing in the ears periodically. And I remember when I was a teenager, I often had ringing in the ears. Turns out that tinnitus is actually quite common.
Well, yeah, and actually, I think if you sit in a quiet room and listen hard enough, anyone's going to hear a ringing at some level, because it's just the sound of the blood going through the capillaries in your eardrum, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
Mystery solved. Well, so the upshot is this kid is scheduled for yet another MRI, another follow-up appointment with a neurologist, and meanwhile he's also been referred to an inner ear specialist he's supposed to see within the next couple of weeks. Now, while this was...
How much is it actually bothering him, the ringing?
Well, it was just something he kind of mentioned, and he said it was something that he noticed when he was in an unusually quiet place at camp.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't really bothering him, but he just happened to mention to his parents, and they thought it should be looked at.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the kind of thing. I mean, 13-year-old boys can be really, really hypochondriacs, at least judging from my own experience with myself. And,
I guess what bothers me, I'm sure, you and I are both about the same age, and so I'm 53. I've got friends who at least once a year are now getting colonoscopies.
Once a year?
Prostate exams. Does that seem like a lot to you?
Well, yeah, they recommend every 3 to 5 years if you have a family history of colon cancer, and they recommend every 10 years otherwise.
Really, for a colonoscopy?
For colonoscopy.
How about a prostate exam?
Well, that apparently used to be gospel that you were supposed to have that every year, but from what I understand, that's kind of falling out of favor because they're realizing that if you have prostate trouble, I think this is how the argument goes, and I'm not advocating this, but that if you have prostate trouble, you'll probably know it, and then you can get checked. And also that, especially in older men, I mean, if you live to a certain age, you're probably going to get a very, very slow, smoldering prostate cancer that's probably not going to, become a problem. You'll probably outlive the cancer, I guess is one way to put it.
Well, I guess, these tests are very expensive. So this family I was describing, they have an insurance plan, but they're just, paying $20 or so for every one of these visits. But somebody is paying for these expensive medical tests.
Well, moderation is obviously the answer, don't you think?
But that's not, to me, as far as I can tell, moderation isn't what's going on in the medical testing area. And so the doctors err on the side of caution because they're so afraid of lawsuits.
Being sued, yeah. Well, that sounds like this case with the friend's son with the tinnitus.
Yeah. Erring on the side of caution.
Yeah, but I remember that really has changed. My father was a doctor before he died,
really?
and when I was growing up, when you're like 13, you're starting to read a lot of stuff about science and things, and you're really curious about the world. You're curious about yourself, and then you hear something like this ringing, and you go, "Oh God, wow, why is my ear ringing? I wonder if other people's ears are ringing." And you don't really know, and you live long enough and you realize that almost everything turns out to be nothing. Right. But, when you're that young, I remember getting really worried one day. I was standing out literally in left field in a softball game, and I was looking up at the sky, and I noticed these kind of amoeba-like thread things floating around, and then I realized that it wasn't a UFO, but that it was in my vision. And,
right.
Yeah, they were floaters.
Yeah, floaters, sure.
Yeah, and
now, what are those caused by?
Oh, man, now I have floaters all over the place. But, I'd go and talk to my dad about this, and his attitude was always, any kind of complaint I'd come up with, I'd tell him, and he'd say, "Oh, it's just growing pains."
That sounds like the kind of doctor you'd want to have.
Yeah.
My impression is that doctors nowadays don't take that attitude, again, because I think it's two incentives. One is they're afraid of lawsuits. The other is that there's a lot of money to be made in this test. The doctor might not make the money personally, but he has a symbiotic relationship with some of the testing companies.
Yeah.
As far my attitude is I'm very fortunate to have come from a family that overall is very long-lived. So I have 4 grandparents, all lived well into their 90s. My mother died when she was 60 of breast cancer, but my father is very healthy at the age of 82. I'm not going to get tested. I'm not going to have my prostate tested. I'm not going to be tested for colon cancer because I don't want to take the time, and I'm not convinced. I know in the case of prostate tests and mammograms, the evidence that they extend life is basically non-existent.
Yeah,
for
but
mammograms
again,
over the age of 50, then there seems to be some benefit. But for prostate exams,
well, I think you're under. Well, the thing with a prostate exam is annoying and uncomfortable, but it takes all of 30 seconds. So.
Well, they've got some now, so instead of having the guy stick his finger up your ass, they've got the PSA test, right?
I know those are really controversial, but, just a regular, prostate check. I mean, presumably you're going to the doctor every once in a while anyway, so.
Not really.
No. But you haven't, you're 53 and you haven't gotten a colonoscopy?
No.
I mean, everything I've read says that if there's 1 or 2 of these pre-screening kind of tests that are considered really legitimate and helpful, that a colonoscopy is one of them. Or if not a colonoscopy, at least some lesser test, like something they call, a sigmoidoscopy, which is a little less extensive and a little less expensive, too. or
if
just
you have risk factors in your family. So if I had a close relative...
No, but even if you don't have risk factors, they recommend you get one every decade, which seems pretty modest.
Well, I have tried to find some empirical evidence to back up my visceral distrust of all these medical tests. And I actually found a guy who's at the Dartmouth Medical School named Gilbert Welch. So he's got some coverage in the Times, and he wrote a book a few years ago called "Should I Be Tested for Cancer?"
Yeah.
And there was a great Denise Grady actually did a great Q&A with him a few years ago.
Oh, Denise Grady, my colleague at the Times.
Yes, Denise Grady at the Times on his skepticism about the benefits of tests. And
I've read some of this. He's gotten quite a lot of mileage on all of this.
He is, and he has. And at the very end, he says he's 49 years old. He says his father died at 60 from colon cancer.
Yeah.
And he said for that reason he plans to be screened within the next few years.
Yeah, so even he's getting screened.
Within the next few years because he has a risk factor. So he's not saying that people without... And, his father died at 60. So that's a pretty important risk factor.
Yeah.
He's not saying that everybody should get these tests beyond a certain age.
Well,
my feeling
it depends
is
on
also,
the test, though. I mean, I think you can't really lump them all in together. Like I'm looking now at an article on a website for the American Association for Cancer Research, and they actually quote this guy Welch, right up top. But then they go on and go through and talk about which tests they consider to be probably a little suspect in their value, and others that they think are pretty solid. And the one at the top of the list under what really works is a colonoscopy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the article's called Reality Check. It's very well balanced, and I found another thing too on it was a Wall Street Journal article. It looks like it was picked up by the Chicago Times called "Which Cancer Screenings Work," and they go through this whole thing too. They quote Welch, and then when they really start hashing it out again, they come down in favor of getting a colonoscopy.
I guess I realize that I'm verging on being an irrational crank, as opposed to all my other totally rational views on this issue. I just have a really deep distrust of medicine, and it seems to be
but again,
growing
it depends
over
on the
time.
doctor. I actually went to the doctor this week, so just coincidentally, because I'd been having a problem. One thing that I have a genetic predisposition to is ulcers, and my father had, when he was about, not quite 65, he had a hemorrhaging ulcer and had to be hospitalized and had to have most of his stomach removed. And even though you can live amazingly well with most of your stomach removed, surprisingly. And,
I guess a lot of people are having that done deliberately to control their...
at least they have staples or something. But I mean, it's not good because it reduces your efficiency in absorbing nutrition from your food. But he still lived to be 83, but, the last... decade and a half of his life was pretty difficult, and he just kind of slowly faded away. But so I've just ever since I can remember, I have occasionally I'll get a little burning sensation in the top of my stomach, and I don't worry about it too much. And then I'll just drink 1 cup of coffee a day and cut down, and then I'm usually fine, or take some antacids. But this time it got a lot worse, so I decided to go to the doctor. But she was very conservative. I wanted to have an upper endoscopy where they put the the camera down your esophagus, and look at your stomach and things. And she thought that was going too far, and I really didn't need to do that, and I should just take some of these super Nexium free sample pills that she gave me, and then come back if it didn't improve. But I just said, no, I really want to know what's going on, because this is something that it worries me. And
interesting.
I think,
we're totally the opposite on this.
Yeah, so I said I'd really like to just do it anyway, and she said, oh well, okay, so I'm going to do one on Monday.
By the way, it's totally settled that ulcers are caused by bacteria now.
Oh, yeah,
right?
I got that test a few years ago, and it came out negative. And
the test for
H. pylori bacteria.
So
yeah, I don't seem to have that. Although she did order a blood test for that too, because I said, well, maybe they missed it the first time. But again, she was very conservative. I hadn't. I go about once a year. It had been about 18 months, and she said, well, I don't think I'll order a cholesterol panel. I just assumed she'd do the full blood panel like they usually do. And she said, I don't think I'll order that because, every time we've tested your cholesterol, it's just been great. So I don't see any reason to think it's changed. So, but she could have easily just routinely thrown that test in, and it would have been, another, I don't know how much money that the insurance company would have absorbed. But, so not all doctors are like that.
Yeah, I guess I'm, I don't know. There are a few incidents that I've heard about over the years. There are a few things that make me skeptical. First of all, as I'm sure I've mentioned in past blogging heads, there is the fact that, cancer, I guess, is the medical problem that I'm most worried about.
Yeah.
And everybody our age is obsessed with getting cancer, and there are all these tests to find different cancers. And the fact is that the massive increase in testing for cancer that's taking place over the last few decades has not led to a decrease in mortality rates for cancer. So, you commonly hear that survival rates increase, but survival rate is a measure of the time from when you're first diagnosed to when you die.
Oh, right. And that's an interesting little statistical fluke, isn't it?
That's right. So, of course, they're detecting the cancer earlier, and so...
So by definition, you survive longer.
But you still die at the same time in absolute terms.
Right. That was one of the really interesting points that Welch made, that, that's something that never occurred to me.
And in the meantime, to me, quality of life is a tremendously important factor when I'm thinking about my health and how to deal with a disease like cancer. And as soon as you're diagnosed, of course, you're gripped by the anxiety of knowing you have cancer. Then the treatments start, which have severe side effects themselves. Let me just tell you another story that's really haunted me over the years.
Yeah.
This involved a friend of mine who's also a science writer. I think this happened about 10 years ago. His mother, who at the time was in her mid-70s and felt fine. She was driving and was in a fender bender, and I guess she sort of banged her ribs, and so they took x-rays, and they saw some nodules on her liver. Mm-hmm. And they said, oh my God, you've got liver cancer, even though she had no symptoms up to that time. They immediately started a very aggressive regimen. I'm not sure if it was radiation or chemotherapy or both. She was dead within a week.
Yeah.
Because of her reaction to the treatment.
Well, they know that it was the treatment that killed her?
Oh, yes. It was definitely, well, at least according to my friend, it was definitely the treatment. I mean, the cause and effect was very strong because she had felt fine before she was in this accident. And the injury from the accident was actually quite minor.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. I've never heard of anyone just immediately, quickly being killed by either chemotherapy or radiation. And I had some fairly up close experience with both of those a few years ago with my wife.
Yeah. Well, I've had family members who have gone through cancer too. I've never seen anything as dramatic as what happened to my friend's mother, but I certainly have seen the awful suffering that's caused by chemotherapy and radiation.
Well, yeah, but I've also, you hear all the time about, you read about men and women in their 40s getting colon, just suddenly, dying of by the time they find they have cancer, which started out as a single organ cancer like colon cancer that could have been caught with early screening, they're it's metastasized to several other organs and it's stage 4, in which case you're probably going to die. But
well, this actually happened to my mother. She had breast cancer when she was in her 40s. It was treated successfully, and then she was in her mid-50s and had these awful headaches, and complained to her doctor. They're sort of like migraines, and she had mood changes. She was getting really cranky, and which is unlike her. And she went to her regular doctor, and he put her on antidepressants. He thought it was pre-menopause problems, and the headaches persisted. My father insisted she see another doctor, and he immediately sent her to get a CAT scan, and it turned out she had a peach-sized tumor in her brain.
Yeah.
So I know these things happen.
Well, so the first doctor then wasn't aggressive enough.
No, he wasn't.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to say I see both sides.
Yeah.
But my feeling is that it's a personal decision for me. I just choose to wait until I have some symptoms before I go and get tested again, because my family genetically, except for my mother who died of breast cancer, which obviously I'm not at risk for, my family is extremely healthy, so I'm going to take my chances. And
so the chance you're taking is when the symptoms show up, you'll already have maybe a stage 2 or stage 3 or stage 4 cancer, and then it'll be all over.
Thanks, George. You're not going to change my mind on this.
No, I just think colon, it's not so bad, John. I had one when I was 51 years old. I decided, now that I'm half a century old, it's amazing that people even live that long. I decided to treat myself to something called the Executive Physical at the Mayo Clinic.
Oh, you got that thing? That's like the worst. It's not the whole body scan, is it?
No, they don't do a whole body scan.
Oh, okay.
But it was great. I mean, I was just so impressed too. This was the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, and boy, talk about a class act. And one thing that really struck me, I mean, it was really kind of a joke, me getting an executive physical or.
No, we think of you as the executive of science journalism, George.
Yeah, I was, my insurance paid about 50 cents on the dollar, so, and I got it. But basically, I was anxious. I thought, well, God, I know I'm supposed to get a colonoscopy, and I was very anxious. I thought, well, God, what if the guy slips and punctures my intestine, and, this happens about as often as somebody gets struck by lightning on the golf course, probably. But I thought, well, if someone's going to do this, I want to make sure it's really good. And I thought, well, they probably, have pretty good standards at the Mayo Clinic. So I decided to have it there. And then while I was doing it, I thought, they said, well, it's easy enough to do an upper endoscopy at the same time, since you've been complaining of, ulcer-type symptoms and so they did that. It was actually very pleasant. First they shoot you full of Versed, which is kind of this liquid Valium, some kind of diazepam. So. That's different. Well, yes.
They get you high when you're going through it. Well, sure, okay.
It's just amazing. I mean, it just kind of, you don't even know it's taking effect, and then suddenly it's like, they're cramming this thing down your throat, and they're saying, this might be a little uncomfortable, and you're saying, no. Yeah, just cram that thing down there.
Bring it on. Hey, did they give you any X-rays?
Let's see, what did I get? There was another thing I got which the insurance company wouldn't pay for, but they do a CT scan just of your heart, and they look for calcium in your artery.
Okay, so they did give you X-rays.
So yeah, that was an X-ray. And then my favorite one was they did a it was like a full-time live scan of your heart while you were, marching on an exercise treadmill thing. Mm-hmm. And they would show it to you. You could actually see, it was ultrasound, that's what it was. And you could see your heart, and you could even see your heart valve flapping open and closed.
Ooh.
It was really cool.
That would be creepy.
Yeah, it was creepy. These valves, you see the pictures in the the Science Times diagrams or Scientific American, and you imagine this valve as being like something geometrical and manufactured, and it's just this thing that looks like, some torn old piece of Kleenex or something, that's just flapping back and forth. And, this is what your heart valve looks like.
An old dirty rag flapping in the wind.
Oh, but the whole thing was just a blast. I really liked it. They have a hotel you can stay with right there on the grounds. And
wow, this is a real difference between us, because that sounds like an absolute
But I felt so
nightmare
good when
to
I
me.
left. I drove from Santa Fe. And when I was done, I drove back, and I just felt so great. I thought, wow, here I am, 51 years old, and I've just passed the executive physical at the Mayo Clinic, and, I'm
And the
still healthy.
Valium had worn off by this point?
Oh, yeah. It wears off pretty quickly. They go and sit you in the cafeteria. But, another thing that really impressed me about Mayo when I was there, for one thing, it's a non-profit organization. And the other thing I noticed...
And you're not receiving any kickbacks from Mayo Clinic for
No.
description of their program?
I mean, one thing, I used to go, when I worked for the Times on staff and lived in New York, for a while I was going to this HMO there, and it was like seeking medical care at the motor vehicle department. It was just horrible. And in Mayo, by contrast, of course they're going to be nice to the people paying for the executive physical, but
sure.
In addition, I noticed, there were all these people there, they're like, 80-year-old couples who just, driven in from Oklahoma or Iowa in their RVs, and they were living in their RVs in the parking lot. And every person that I saw, including the most annoying people that were really hassling the staff, was just treated with such complete, respect and compassion. And it was just very clear to me that they really trained their staff to, just to realize that getting any kind of medical treatment can be a very intimidating experience, and that you have to be very, very patient with people. So I want to do it again. I just don't, it's just, I couldn't afford it every year.
Saving up your money for the next one.
Yeah, I think the whole thing came to $6,000 or $7,000.
Holy cow, Jesus!
Well, 50% got picked up by the insurance.
No wonder
company.
our insurance premiums are so goddamn high, George.
Yeah, but I paid for half of it. So.
Yeah, but the rest of us paid for the other half. This is why I had to get a goddamn job, because I couldn't afford health insurance, because people like you are going and getting these wacky executive full body exams.
It's not wacky. It's a good physical.
Hey,
everyone should get a good physical at least every 5 years. But
I'm gonna post a link on an article I found also saying that the risks of these X-rays are not negligible. They really add up over time, and so it's this irony that X-rays that look for cancer can actually cause cancer. It is not a statistically insignificant effect.
Yeah, but flying on the airplane to go to the cancer center where you're getting your X-ray can also expose you to.
Yeah, but it's more than that. It's not. You can't discount that. I'll send a link.
Yeah, I'd like to read that
worried.
because that goes against most of what I've heard about X-rays.
No, it's something that I think we're practically dead already, but it's something that I worry about when it comes to my children.
Yeah.
I really don't want them getting tested if it's not absolutely necessary, especially if it's a radiative test.
Yeah.
The great thing about MRIs.
Do you look to get dental X-rays?
Pardon me?
If
if they have to get them.
Yeah.
But and that's why MRIs are a great innovation, because of course they don't expose you to ionizing radiation.
Yeah.
But then there's the risk of false positives, which I think is what this son of this friend of mine is going through. And anyway, okay,
but PET scans are. Yeah, I don't know. You just really think it's important to keep the other side in mind, that if you find out you have cancer and it's already untreatable, you're going to be running through a whole lot more money from your insurance company than $7,000.
But in the meantime, I will have lived more of my life without having the black cloud of cancer hanging over my head.
Yeah. No, I guess I just have a different. I have a different perspective, but no, I think. But you're talking about, $7,000 and what a burden that is on society since the insurance companies have to pick it up. But, if you have cancer, it's going to be $100,000 minimum.
That's true.
You can easily go to $1 million.
I feel like as I said, I'm not a risk factor. I think the genetics really carry a lot of weight.
Yeah.
Just a funny story about the philosopher Paul Feyerabend. I've mentioned him, I think, in previous blogging.
Oh yeah, he was the real anti-science guy that you profiled in. You had that wonderful profile of him in The End of Science, where you tell it. It's just
he was, after I interviewed Kuhn and Popper, I was told that the wildest science philosopher of them all is this guy Paul Feyerabend. He's written these viciously anti-science books and essays, and so I started reading his stuff, and it was really over the top. And he had some rants about doctors in particular. He made it sound as though they were all Nazis, like Nazi doctors. Yeah. Really over the top stuff, which is
You're
why
kind of guy.
I sought him out. And so he, I finally met him in New York in the early '90s. Interviewed him. I did a profile of him for Scientific American, and we didn't really talk about medicine that much. But he took a few shots. But then I heard from he had this wonderful Italian physicist, beautiful woman, who was his wife, who had finally made him happy. He was this miserable person most of his life. And she contacted me and said he was dying of brain cancer, and it took him really rapidly. And so after I actually read in the Times that he died, an obituary, and I called her up and to offer my condolences, but I couldn't help asking, how did he react to the diagnosis? Did he put himself in the hands of the doctors? And she said, absolutely. He had wonderful doctors. He did exactly what they said. They just caught the tumor so late that they couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah. But he did seek medical treatment.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's not my problem. I mean, once something happens to me, I'll try to find the best medical care that I can. It's just I figure as long as I feel good, healthy, I'm not going to pay somebody to try to find something wrong with me. That's just my attitude.
Well, it does get really extreme. Like a few years ago, and I'm sure this still happens, there was this, it's this big, 16, however many wheels they have, wheeler semi-truck pulls into town and parks in a parking lot, and they offer full body CAT scans for $100.
Those things are terrible.
So it's moderation in all things is the
those things in particular.
To say.
What I've read is those full body scans are really, it's not good for you.
Yeah.
You don't need that kind of.
No, that's stupid. Radiation. And then there's always the problem of false positives. And,
yes, definitely.
Well, when you're talking about whether doctors having this kind of subtle sort of incentive to order more tests, even if they're not profiting from them, even if they don't own part of the testing lab, which I guess in some cases they do. But really, that kind of reminded me of this whole issue that we were also thinking of talking about of cooperation and evolution of cooperation.
Yeah, that article in the New York Times by
Carl Zimmer.
Carl Zimmer, one of our favorite writers.
Because I was thinking, there's this phenomenon where people will, like basically if the doctor, if the internist orders some tests and then just sort of unconsciously decides to, order a few extra tests and, maybe, a very conservative approach would demand, then, I guess the theory would be that the testing lab is grateful and then they might reciprocate tit for tat, but more subtle probably. It's just that there's maybe possibly a survival reason for being known as the kind of person who does favors for other people, or it's not the best example with the medical thing, but just the whole question of why people will say. I think they used this in the article. So why will somebody take a couple hours off work to pick up a friend at the doctor? and it gets nothing out of it except just this what seems to be this pure altruism. And,
why is that?
Yeah, I mean, Francis Collins, the what was Francis Collins' book?
The director, The Language of God or something?
Language of God, the director of what?
Director of the Human Genome Project,
the Human Genome Project. Yeah, I mean, he would say that this is one of those things that proves that there has to be a God and a soul and all of this.
Christ, right? Not that again!
Yeah, no, I know I said I was tired of this science and religion.
We can't stay away from
religion. But the whole thing that's cool about this evolution of cooperation research is it provides an alternative for thinking within a scientific framework about why it might make perfect rational sense to be altruistic, right?
Yeah. I guess the question of altruism doesn't seem as mysterious to me as it should. It can be explained in so many ways. So there are some forms of extreme altruistic behavior. This sort of Sister Teresa taking care of lepers in a third world country model is explained by brainwashing in her youth. I assume she was brought up by Catholic parents who convinced her that the best thing she could do with her life would be to emulate the life of saints. When it comes to sort of more ordinary acts of generosity, you just mentioned somebody driving a friend to the hospital or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Where it's not a blood relative, so they don't have any genes in common, so you can't come up with a pure selfish gene explanation.
Well, I guess it would be again that could come from training, and that from infancy we're taught to care for others, and that these sort of selfless acts are good for us. Yeah. And I think you get that whether you have atheistic socialist parents or religious.
I think a lot of it really rings true to me that it emerges out of this idea that it really is to your advantage in the long run to have a reputation as a nice guy or someone who does favors for someone else, and
that's right.
And I guess they use game theory to come up with models of that, and that's what Zimmer's article was about. This guy, was it Robert Nowak? Who does some of these mathematical models of game theory to try to explain how cooperation might evolve, and to show that it doesn't have to be something that's instilled top down by some supernatural being.
Well, I guess the important point to make when you're talking about these sort of models of altruism that show how altruism can still be explained in terms of selfish gene theory is that they are, the Darwinians are usually careful to point out that we are not consciously calculating the net benefit of an act of friendship.
Right.
It's something that these sort of games and calculations have been carried out through evolutionary time, and they are embedded in us as these emotional impulses that we have to be compassionate or to be generous toward friends or even towards total strangers. It comes out not as conscious calculation, it comes out as a very powerful emotional tendency. And the counter-emotional tendency is that we are very quick to recognize people who will take advantage of our generosity, or people who are part of a network of generally altruistic individuals who are sort of sitting on the sidelines and not really contributing but getting the benefits.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that's come out of game theory as well, is that you need to have punishment of cheaters to make these sort of networks of altruism and cooperation work.
Well, otherwise you'd get into, it would turn out then that altruism might not in the long run be good for you, and it wouldn't become instilled as an emotional tendency, a genetically controlled emotional tendency. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So I mean, this is the thing that the great guru Robert Wright wrote about in his book
Non-zero.
Non-Zero.
Well, and also, yeah, also in Moral Animal.
Right, and Moral Animal, but that, again, to me, it just seems obvious. And actually, this is something that drives me crazy. I'm sorry to bring this up again about religious people when they say that without religion, we all become basically sociopaths. We pursue our own self-interest, and everybody else be damned. Our self-interest, of course, is bound up with the self-interest of other people.
Right,
Our impulse to love other people, to fall in love with somebody, to love our genetic relatives, of course that is very deeply embedded in us. But
again, cooperation too. It just goes down to such a deep biological level. The classic example is the slime mold.
Yeah, right.
And where you have these individual organisms, these little slime molds that are, separate little organisms, and they're just kind of, slithering around the forest floor. And then if they, I think the way it goes is if they're running out of food, each little slime mold will react by sending out a chemical signal that the other slime mold will register, and the result of all this is that the slime mold will come together and form this kind of multicellular organism.
It's amazing. It's like one creature that spans this enormous transition from unicellular life to multicellular life. I think actually Bob wrote about that in Three Scientists and Their Gods.
Yeah, I think that's where I first heard about it, and then I used it. I was remembering when we were talking earlier about cooperation before we started recording that I had written a piece, I don't know, well over 5 years ago probably, on evolution of cooperation research at the Santa Fe Institute. And see, I'm trying to find it here. It was called "Mindless Creatures Acting Mindfully." See if I got that thing about.
Great title.
Yeah, it wasn't mine, as we know, and no one else outside of journalism knows. It seems we don't write our own headlines. Which, of course, the headlines often get you into trouble.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a single-celled creature called the slime mold. Slithers amoeba-like around the ground, lapping up nutrients. But when the food supply runs out, it has a biochemical panic attack, frantically sending out molecular signals to other nearby slime molds, which in turn send out signals of their own. And then, guided by these primitive conversations, the individual cells come together to form a multicelled organism, sprouting a stalk and a head of spores that become the seeds of the next generation. So, so they're cooperating in this very basic biochemical level. And I guess people have also talked about, the way all of the muscles of the heart coordinate with each other to, beat in rhythm is a kind of cooperation.
This guy, Nowak, there's a passage in this Times piece, this came out in the Science Times just on Tuesday, where he says that he thinks cooperation is one of the 3 basic principles of evolution. So, the original formulations of evolution have always been sort of nature red and tooth and claw and survival of the fittest, and it's all about competition. But here he says that the 3 basic principles are cooperation, mutation, and selection. He doesn't even bring up competition here, which is interesting. I guess competition is sort of implicit in the principle of selection. And, going back to cancer, you have to tie everything together.
Yeah, if you can.
He talks about cancer as a breakdown of cooperation. So, the human body is basically this marvel of specialized cells that all come with their own selfish agenda, that somehow all come together and cooperate to produce something like, this whole very efficiently functioning organism made out of all these tiny little somewhat independent parts.
Yeah.
But cancer is the breakdown of this system of cooperation, and cancerous cells have a mutation that makes them break apart from the herd and reproduce in a way that is sort of insane from the picture of the larger health of the organism.
Yeah, the renegade cell.
Yeah,
that's kind of the image that. There was a famous oncologist who wrote a book by that title. I think he kind of used that same paradigm, which I think is really helps you understand a lot.
Yeah, I've got a segue into the other topic that we wanted to talk about. That is really bizarre. I just came upon this in Science magazine this morning. A piece on altruism and or cooperation and subliminal priming. Where is this piece?
Oh, well, there was something on that priming in the Times too, right?
Yeah.
Benedict Carey's piece.
Well, so this is a segue though from altruism to priming.
Okay, how are you going to do this?
This is July 27th, Science. I'm holding it up here. I don't think you can get these online unless you're a subscriber. I'll post a link to it anyway, or maybe.
Yeah, occasionally they take some of their articles and they feature them on their free website, but I don't know.
Well, this is one of the kind of featurey essays toward the front of the magazine.
Okay.
But here, this is just bizarre. There was an experiment in which the researchers glued a pair of paper eyeballs to a donation box in a cafeteria. And when the eyeballs were on the box, people put much more money into the box than when there were no eyeballs on the box.
Wow.
This is in Science magazine. This isn't in Discover or some, one of these flaky publications. A picture showing a pair of eyes attached to a cafeteria collection box significantly raises the donated amount compared to a flower symbol. The eyes were most effective when looking directly at the observer. Huh. And I mean, obviously nobody's looking at this and thinking, these are like little paper eyes. Nobody's looking at it and thinking, oh my God, there must be somebody in that box looking at me. I should put some money in.
So it's all unconscious. Yeah.
Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah, that's really weird. That's even weirder than the examples that Benedict Carey had in his article about that this week.
Well, although some of the examples in that article were pretty amazing.
Yeah, the one about the coffee?
Yeah.
Yeah, and how did that go?
Well, let's see. That was really strange. So there are some students who are, I guess, they're going to participate in some experiment, but unbeknownst to them, the experiment has actually started on their way to the lab.
Oh, right,
They pass a laboratory assistant who's holding textbooks, a clipboard, papers, and a cup of either hot or ice coffee, and the assistant asks the student for a hand and actually says, here, could you hold this coffee for a second? Mm-hmm. And so then, the student helps out, holds the coffee, and then goes on to the lab. And then later, the student is tested. The students who held a cup of iced coffee rated a hypothetical person they later read about as being much colder, less social, and more selfish than did the students who had held hot coffee. It doesn't...
Yeah, isn't that amazing? It's all unconscious, obviously.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's scary when you think about it. I mean, all these decisions that are being made every day, by our world leaders might swing one way or the other because whoever bumped into them had hot or cold coffee in their hands. I mean, that would be the the ridiculous extreme to take this to, but it's interesting because there are some other examples that I.
There's another one where there are some students in a room and they're playing this some kind of investment game. So I guess they've got some money and they're told to they've got various options for investing it. and they're sitting in a room, and the variable is that they either have a briefcase sitting on the table across from them, and they're not told what it's there for. It's just sort of it's supposed to be that somebody's just left it there. A briefcase or a backpack.
Right.
So when the briefcase is there, the students are much more stingy, as the article puts it, with their money than if it's just a backpack.
Yeah.
And so the explanation is supposed to be the mere presence of the briefcase, noticed but not consciously registered, generated business-related associations and expectations.
Wow.
It just, I spend so much time denigrating psychology and neuroscience that I like to give them credit when they come up with something really cool. And this is, that is just, you're right, it is really disturbing. But it's also just, it's fascinating. It's sort of like, I'm surprised. I don't think they brought up Freud in here, but of course, this, I'm sure most people reading this will think of, Freud and the unconscious when they read this. It's just that Freud, it was all, it's all sex.
Yeah.
It's all sex and aggression and
and it's also kind of an old-fashioned idea, this, that there's something called the unconscious, that's, in the depths of your brain, and then there's the conscious part of your brain, and then it seems like research from numerous different fronts in cognitive science has led us to this idea that actually most of the brain is unconscious, which is not really surprising, and that there's just this tiny little sliver of consciousness riding on top of this, and most of what's going on is just happening behind the curtain.
Yeah, except that the unconscious processes are just kind of, doing calculations and system maintenance and sort of boring stuff, not the really exciting. Oh yeah,
but I was thinking more of like Daniel Dennett has this this theory of consciousness that he calls the multiple drafts theory and the Cartesian theater, and the idea is kind of that all this stuff is coming in through your senses all the time. And of this just overwhelming amount of information, only a tiny little bit of it is kind of put together. It's sort of like like a snatch here and a snatch there is sort of woven into this conscious narrative that we take as the illusion of me, the conscious I, going through life and having this experience, but that it's like 99.9. It's like dark matter or dark energy. Yeah. It's like the vast amount of it is just completely out of sight, and then the brain just kind of constructs this narrative on top of that. So this research to me kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, I guess it also suggests that the way that random perceptions can affect us emotionally without our even being aware of it, and emotionally in ways that actually may have a significant effect on our behavior. That's the examples here are just so sort of it really makes it seem like an awfully random process. It makes it feel we've talked about free will before, and I have to admit this, and I like to believe in free will, but this is sort of upsetting if you are a free will believer, because it erodes your autonomy a little bit to think that running into somebody holding iced coffee might affect your attitude toward people that you're meeting later in the day. Yeah.
And it makes you wonder about some of the big decisions you've made in life.
Well, I wonder that all the time anyway.
But I don't know about free will, because it just seems to me that it's so easy to think that you're making a decision when you're really not. And, whenever you're really faced with some really, fairly stark decision, like, am I going to buy a house or not, or take this job or not, or just anything like that. You agonize over it, and you go back and forth, and you marshal support on either side, and then have this dialogue and this internal debate, and then suddenly, you just go back and forth, and you're just sort of in this oscillating mode, and then you just randomly flip. And
I don't believe it is random. I mean, we could. I know. Hey, we're actually disagreeing quite a bit in this one.
I think it's random if you're up against two pretty. If it's pretty much even. Like you could really, you're really in a dilemma because either way has equal advantages and equal trade-offs, and you get to the point where you literally are flipping a coin, except it's a brain cell that's randomly flipping one way or the other.
Or it's not a brain cell; it's that you drove by somebody driving a cherry red Hummer, and that affects your subconscious in some way, and makes you decide to apply to Harvard Law School.
Yeah, because you know someone with red hair who went to Harvard Law School.
What I thought was really strange about these examples was their metaphorical quality. So the idea that iced coffee would lead you to judge people as cold later on is, it's just really peculiar because it's so metaphorical. And it actually reminded me of one of the most interesting articles I've read in neuroscience in quite a long time. It's by B.S. Ramachandran at UCal San Diego. He's one of the great... Rama. One of the great... He co-wrote a book with Sandy Blakesley, who was your blogging hedge partner a while back.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw this article by him. I'll put a link on this. It came out. I saw him give a talk on it, and then it came out in Scientific American. It was on synesthesia, and what synesthesia tells us about the brain and about cognition in general.
And synesthesia is like when you listen to music and you see colors instead.
That's right. It's basically one sensory modality affects other sensory modalities. So the common one is that you hear music and you see all these psychedelic patterns, and actually that's a very common effect of taking psychedelics or smoking lots of pot and so forth. But it can go all sorts of ways. So certain colors will make you, there are people who see something that's green and they smell steak, or they hear a certain sound and it gives them a certain tactile sensation. So it's just cross-sensory. It's a cross-sensory phenomenon in general. Rama thinks that this occurs because of basically short-circuiting in the brain.
Yeah.
And that the most extreme manifestation of the short-circuiting is synesthesia. But he thinks that there are milder forms of this that lead to metaphors and generalizations and all these sort of leaps of logic that both very creative people make, and very creative people are more likely to have synesthesia, or just ordinary people, because we're all creatures of metaphor, that we think in metaphors without even realizing it all the time.
You just make a connection. You explain one thing in terms of something else, or
So Rama, if you haven't read this article, you definitely should check it out, because it's like, who knows if it's true, but it's just this incredibly creative, really interesting hypothesis about sort of the evolution of our ability to create metaphors, to make analogies, to think creatively. It's he's saying this has to do not only with art but also with science, with all types of creative thinking.
Yeah, anytime. I mean, of course, the science writers were using metaphor all the time, where you take something unfamiliar and try to explain it in terms of the familiar, but then the scientists are doing the same thing.
And we all do it. Again, going back to this Times article, iced coffee how people subconsciously are connecting iced coffee to iciness as a personality trait.
Yeah, it's obviously very deeply ingrained. Douglas Hofstadter's done some really interesting research on metaphor. Yeah, we should we should talk about that sometime, or maybe we could even get Doug to do one of these. I don't know.
That would be great. He's he was sort of like a cult phenomenon in the 80s. He wrote the book Gödel, Escher, and Bach. Yeah.
Yeah, and he also his new book is just. I think I mentioned this on an earlier conversation, but his new book is just really good.
I Am a Strange Loop?
I'm a Strange Loop, yeah. I reviewed it for Scientific American, and it's really good.
We should have him out. I was thinking of having him on as a speaker at my school.
Oh, that would be great, yeah.
I read Gödel, Escher, and Bach, and this book that he co-wrote with Dan Dennett called
The Mind's Eye.
Back in the 80s, and that sort of helped to convince me to become a science writer.
Ah, yeah.
So, you can blame it on Douglas Hofstadter.
That book really affected me, the first one. It was just, I remember reading it. I remember seeing it for the first time in a bookstore on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C., and just seeing this thing and just looking at it and thinking, wow, this looks like I just stood there for about an hour flipping through the pages, and I didn't buy it at the time because I was a poor graduate student, and then I got my first good job at the Minneapolis Star, and then I bought it in Minneapolis and read it, and it was just, it just kept me up night after night until I was done, and it inspired me to want to meet Doug. So I proposed a series of articles on artificial intelligence for the newspaper that hired me, and they thought, oh, that sounds cool. And as part of this, I got to go out to Bloomington, Indiana, and spend an afternoon with Douglas Hofstadter, and then we got to know each other and seen each other on and off over the years. And
oh, you're very fortunate. I'd love to meet him.
He's a great guy.
Well, so
I guess we're kind of getting up near the end here.
Well, I'll just mention that I guess so. We both have guests coming up soon.
Yeah.
Next week, I'm going to be talking to a guy who happens to be a neighbor here in Garrison, but is also, I think, one of the most important journalists on the planet. His name is Andy Revkin.
Ah.
He's covering certainly one of the most important scientific beats that there is, climate change and global warming, at the most important newspaper in the world, the New York Times. So
and he's a hell of a good guitarist too.
And he's a hell of a good guitarist. Yeah, he plays with the great folk singer Pete Seeger up here sometimes.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had Andy out in Santa Fe at the workshop one summer, and that last night when we have the big party at Sandra Blakesley's house, and he pulled out his guitar and was mesmerizing the crowd.
He's a multi-talented guy.
He is.
So who are you? Then you're going to be talking to.
Then after that, you'll be on vacation again, right?
Yeah.
Oh, back to and again, you're going to an island.
Yeah, going to Nantucket before I start school again. So as soon as I get back,
great.
then it's. And I finally have to start working for a living again.
Summer's off. That's a good thing. Margaret Wertheim.
Oh, great.
Yeah, she's great. And she's written probably more intelligently than just about anyone on science and religion, and so there we go again. But we may talk about other things as well, because she has an interesting project going on in L.A. And yeah, she wrote a couple of really interesting books. One's called Pythagoras' Trousers, and one's called The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace.
Yeah,
so I'll talk to her.
I've got both of them. I've read and enjoyed both of those books. She's got, I think Pythagoras' Trousers was about the history of women in mathematics and science.
Yeah, something like that. It's been a long time.
So, I look forward.
I always enjoy talking to her off camera. So, and she used to be in television in Australia. So,
really,
so she'll be a lot more photogenic than we are.
Well, that's not hard.
No. I wanted to Just, you know what, since we're winding down here, I wanted to mention my favorite story about Robert Wright, and partly because it ties in with all of this cooperation stuff and tit for tat and unconscious drives for altruism. But this was back when his book, The Moral Animal, came out.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was working on staff at the New York Times as an editor for the Sunday Week in Review section. And we were up on the 6th floor of the building, the old, wonderful, funky building. And on the same floor was the magazine, the travel section, and right across the hall from where I was the book review. So as a result, we get, the book review comes out, at least in those days, it was almost 2 weeks. You could get a hard copy before it was actually came out stuffed in the newspaper. Mm-hmm. So the people in the building would get them, and being right across there, I got an early copy, and I picked it up, and I noticed that there was a full-page review, and I think page 2 or page 3 by Steven Pinker of Robert Wright's new book, The Moral Animal.
I remember.
Yeah, and it was a great review. And then when I got back to my apartment, I just sent Bob an email saying, "Oh well, just you probably already know this, but Steve Pinker no, actually, I said you probably already know this, but the review of your book is in the New York Times Book Review issue for whatever date." And then I just thought, he probably knew this, and then I immediately my phone rings, and it's Bob, and he goes, "Is it the cover?" I said, "No, it's not the cover." He says, "Oh well, how about is there a reefer?" And then who wrote it? Of course, I think that's first he asked me who wrote it, and I said Steve Pinker, and he said, "Oh well, Steve Pinker, that's probably good, huh?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's a good
probably."
Yeah,
they're both proselytizers for the same field.
Yeah, well, I don't know
psychology.
I don't know how clear the connection was then. I don't know if he really said probably, but he was just asking me all these questions about the review, and then I told him it was Pinker, and then I told him no, there's not a reefer from the cover, but you open it up, it's right there, full page, yeah, full page, and then he said, well, I'd really be grateful if you indulged me, and my wife, I think is what he said, would be very, very pleased if I could have some, quotes from the article. So I was actually, first I'd read him some really quickly just so he knew it was a rave review, and then he asked me to read them back to him slowly so he could transcribe them. And then in the middle of all this, he said, that there's a perfectly good evolutionary explanation for why you're doing this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just struck me as quintessential Bob. This was, it all fit in with game theory, tit for tat, and the evolution of altruism. And then I'm thinking, well, then years later, when Bob started getting tied up with the people at Slate, I got an email from him asking me if I wanted to do one of these Slate conversations with them. This was back when you typed conversations instead of talked, and so maybe this was my unconscious or semi-unconscious reward for that. And then of course that's made me grateful enough that now I'm willing to work for free for him every week for an hour doing these Science Saturdays. So you probably have a similar trajectory.
It's all tit for tat. We're just we're driven by our selfish genes. What did Richard Dawkins
free
call
will?
Us? Lumbering automatons that are just vehicles for our selfish genes.
Yeah, that's Dawkins' best line ever.
I don't know. I still do things just because if I like somebody, I do it because it makes me feel good that it makes them feel good.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're right, but...
But of course, that was embedded into me by millennia of evolution.
Yeah.
All of my ancestors having gone through this all before, tit for tat.
Yeah.
So here we are.
It's the most rational explanation.
Anyway,
John, it was good talking to you.
Yeah, so I'll talk to you. I guess we'll get back together.
Yeah, maybe a couple weeks, 3 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, looking forward to it.
All right, so long, George.
Okay, bye.